Okay, I'd like to call the Corporate Services Committee meeting to order and ask anybody to declare pecuniary interest either now if it arises down the agenda. Welcome those again that are visiting us live streaming. Action items, A 2018 budget. Betty Ann.
Good morning and thank you, Mr. Warden. So the 2018 budget, we've had a couple of meetings to date, and at the last meeting you will recall that we presented a budget that was going to reflect a 3.54% increase, and while doing that it was investing an additional $200,000 in our affordable housing. We listened to the direction of committee, and you had asked us to review again, and in particular a couple of items, which we did, and the recommendation that's in front of you today is to establish the levy at an increase of 3.27%. And in doing that, in order to achieve that on, get to the report here. In order to do that, we have made a couple of adjustments, in particular reviewing again the availability of our reserves and the opportunities to perhaps defer or delay. And there are 5 recommendations here that have been included in the budget that you have been presented with today. And under corporate services, we have been putting reserves aside for particular areas, and we can utilize those reserves, additional reserves. There were some already in the original budget. In paramedic services, we reviewed the Port Elgin station, and we're also again looking at the reserves, and you will recall in prior years we have received in-year funding from the province, and it has been transferred to a unassigned paramedic services capital reserve, and we believe that that would be a good use of the funds to start that project. Transportation, in a review of the revenues from the sale equipment, it was recognized that we could increase that by $21,000. And in our health services, in our 2 long-term care, a couple of minor adjustments to the transfer to reserves that were brought forward for the total adjustment of $115,000 to reduce the increase to 3.27 prior to growth. And as a reminder, I did want to highlight certain items that would require consideration outside the budget approval. Just a reminder, the 2 items in health services, transportation, and item 4, again, related to the Port Elgin station. And I just wanted to refer to my colleague, Director McKeag, to speak to the provincial subsidy, as we do have an update that's been received since the writing of this report. Director McKeag.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to report that on October 25th, 2017, we received a notification from the ministry that we will be receiving an increase of funding which amounts to an additional $137,132 for our grant from the government. We had been awaiting this information, and as a result of not having it, it was quite delayed this year. We maintained our budget last year at the grant level of $5,403,491. So this additional $137,132 will be the subject of a report that I'll be bringing back to committee to look at its impact on the items 1 and 2 of this report for your consideration.
Thank you. Paramedic services.
Thank you. So that highlights item 4. Item 5 was just highlighting a reminder of the museum project that when we looked at the capital budgets to how to stabilize that throughout the 5-year. And if you've had an opportunity to review all of those budgets, Darlene has worked her magic, and all available for council on the council Y drive, all of the updated capital and operational budgets. And then the other document, of course, that's showing our operational, the increase of 2.27, the capital change of 6.67, and combined for an increase in the levy of $1,420,008 for an increase of 3.27. And again, that is prior to any assessment growth being applied, and we are certainly confident that prior year budget investments will contribute to a noticeable increase.
Thank you, Betty Ann. Questions? Michael?
I just want to go back to that announcement from Paramedic Services. That increase is on the 2017 budget. That's correct? That's an increase of what we expected and budgeted for in 2017. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, that is correct.
Through you, Mr. Warden, I'll just add too that to remind committee that the 2018 budget, the revenue was not increased from 2017.
So we can reduce the budget another 0.25%? Is that what you're saying?
I believe that the recommendation that Director McKeag will be bringing forward is that because of the outstanding items, 1 and 2, related to health services, certainly item 1, that they would be able to utilize that additional surplus, and any funds that may be found to be surplus in 2018, should we receive additional funds, that they could be applied to these projects that are outside of the 2018 budget, being the Chesley Station upstaffing, the review of that project, and the Port Elgin Station, because there are no funds in the 2018 budget for that. So it would seem that if we were to receive additional funds, that they be transferred to a reserve and could be applied for that purpose or any other purpose that council deems necessary in the future.
Makes sense. If we're going to be doing it down the road.
Well, just a comment, and it just means, I mean, it doesn't mean that you're only spending 3.27 in the year. You look at past years and you take the surplus that you're spending, it's another 2 or 3%. So your actual spending is more than, the way I see it anyway, is more than the...
Because of the prior year surplus that we're applying to reduce the levy? Yes, and that is one of the reasons why over the years we do try to maintain that same level, that we return to reduce the taxpayers so that we don't see that fluctuation, and that we are returning at the same level year over year. And it is problematic when you start increasing what you would apply to the reduce the levy, because then you start seeing those changes, and that wouldn't be reducing and being but that is correct.
Other discussions, comments? So there is a staff recommendation. Do I have a mover and seconder? And then I will open it back up for discussion. Moved by Ann, seconded by Mike. Further discussions? Paul?
Just a clarification on the narrative talks item 4 of the Port Elgin Station. So, and then I thought the narrative we received today. So I'm unclear. Is the $50,000 to start some preliminary design work for the Port Elgin Station in 2018? Is it in the budget?
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
Any other discussions? Hearing none. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? That is carried.
Thank you.
Next action item.
Timely with the passing of the budget, and certainly we want to thank you for that. In March of 2015 was when we first introduced the new templates for our annual budgeting process, and then just recently the capital template, but also when prior to that receiving our first annual business plans and being able to establish us on a road so that council and certainly our taxpayers that were accountable could see the projects that we're involved in, how successful we are with those. And the one piece that was missing with that was really the written documentation. We were certainly following past practices and good guidelines, but in order for our staff to be able to really move forward, it was important that we define the guidelines and certainly recognize that we're accountable to you and certainly to the taxpayers. And you will notice in the policies themselves that the first one, of course, is the annual business plan, and that is out of the Department of the CAO, the Office of the CAO, and the importance of that. And then as we move into the recognition of what the annual budgeting policy, of course, to establish the principles to manage the process. And then finally, the requirements to amend, because you'll recall as we move through the year, there are times when we do need to amend, and we do need to be accountable to you, to the taxpayer, and it was important to be able to define those guidelines. And I think certainly most important was to ensure that we were leaving the responsibility with you as the Corporate Services Committee or the Executive Committee, depending on the issue, that Council is still maintains the authority over certain dollar limits, always when amendments require an unbudgeted transfer from a reserve, and transfers between operational and capital, and any reassignment of surplus funds would always remain as the authority of the Council.
Do I have a mover and seconder? Moved by David, seconded by Robert. Discussions? Anne?
I just, maybe I'm not in the right place, but so when you say salary and benefit allocations can be relocated with the written consent of the chief administrative officer up to a maximum of $150,000, excluding the addition of permanent staff. So when you say we'd always be notified that this has happened, right? Or not?
In this case, this would be a delegated authority to the CAO. What happens oftentimes is that we have vacancies, and often we would want to, if it's use those funds to hire a consultant or to hire temporary staff or to make those changes. And this would allow the latitude for the Chief Administrative Officer to be able to make those changes within a program, so not changing from one program to another between operational and capital, but to be able to continue to utilize the funds so that we're able to meet the requirements of the annual business plan, and to be able to do that. In some cases, it will be maybe brought back to this committee as an information item if the CAO deems that necessary. And this always allows the CAO the permission and to indicate to a director, depending on the issue, that they wish it to be presented, that the CAO requires it to come to committee. That always gives the Chief Administrative Officer, even if there is delegated authority, if the CAO deems it necessary, then a report would be presented to committee. But this allows the work to continue to be done without a delay, in making sure that we meet the requirements of the annual business plans and that our projects continue without disruption.
So, and does it affect the full-time equivalents then as well? Like it?
In this case, the expectation that it would be reallocated on a temporary, so it would just be that if there's vacancies and we're having trouble recruiting, or recruitment we know doesn't, there's always a time delay in that, so this would allow us to bring in consulting services or some type of a temporary fix in the interim.
Okay, thank you.
Any further discussions? Hearing none, all those in favor? Opposed, if any? That is carried. Thank you. Information items? Doesn't want to do it.
There are 4 information items that have been circulated. They all really related to items that we've been talking about regarding the budget and the budget preparation, the tax stabilization reserve, the activity for your information, the working capital reserve for your information, and just to identify what has currently been borrowed from that capital reserve, and just identifying that there really is no further capacity to consider additional requests. The forecasted reserves, based on what we know at this point, what our reserve balances should be expected to at December 31st, and then the 9-month financial statement review indicating what our current financial position is. I will let you know that that statement review will also be included on our agenda for next Thursday with the Executive Committee, as we bring forward also our Q3 departmental updates, and the 9-month financial statement will be considered at that time as well.
Thanks, Brian, for keeping the snow away. If you can continue that till December 31st, that would be great. Other discussions or comments on any of those 4 items? Mike?
Just kind of a question. One of the things that struck out to me was utility surplus that we're likely to see, or potential there. And I guess my question is that a direct result of the investments that we have made, do you think? It's probably an unfair question to you because it's probably a range of things, but it's probably safe to say that a big part of that is the investment that we've made in this.
It is a part of it, but the major part of it is driven by the 8% reduction, the change that was introduced by the province. But we are taking advantage of that, as well as the initial changes that we've seen with the ecosystems. We expect, because we're just in the middle of that, 2018 will be the year that we'll start seeing the savings. But because of that 8%, you'll recall that we're recommending that savings, which could reach to 400,000, is and part of that is a lot of it is driven through our housing component, but that it be applied to the ecosystem project to reduce the long-term debt for that project.
Other discussions, comments? Okay, that was for information. Next meeting, December the 7th. Motion to adjourn.
December the 7th. Oh.
Corporate services, yeah, because we're doing executive next week. Mike? Robert? All those in favor?